Good to see you as well.
Thank you so much for being with us today. I'll give a little bit of an introduction for our time together and of you, and we'll get going. So first, my name is Jacob Shatzer. I am Director of Content at BibleMesh. I also serve at Union University in Jackson, Tennessee. And we have with us today for this conversation Dr. Jerry Lassetter. He has directed the distance learning program at Southeastern Seminary since its creation in 2004, which is a long time, I'll interject, as far as the internet goes, right? Since 2004. He's presented at SACS COC on types of online interaction with an emphasis on interaction with the system, equivalence between modes of class delivery, and faculty development at large institutions. Jerry also completed his dissertation on a literary and poetic analysis of Psalm 90 through 92, and he's taught biblical Hebrew for nearly a decade at Southeastern, as well as Old Testament introduction. Jerry's married to Mary Catherine Lassetter. They've been married for 18 years, and they have 3 kids, Julia, who's about to turn 14, Ella, who is 12, and James, who is 7. Whenever Jerry gets a free moment, he is building something with wood or playing guitar. Thank you so much for being with us, Jerry.
Absolutely. Thank you, sir.
Well, let's kick this off and get some expertise from you on online education. So tell me, why is online or asynchronous education beneficial, important, and worthwhile?
Yeah, that's a great starting question of why should we even care about this enterprise that is online education. The University of Wisconsin-Madison really pioneered some distance education in the 1980s. And I don't mean old-fashioned correspondence courses. That really has been around forever, where essentially you would send a box to students with books and workbooks and worksheets, and they would complete that and send it back. The University of Wisconsin-Madison, some of their faculty really pioneered the first ever what you and I think of as distance learning. And they have really written and published and produced a lot of material on it. Always with an eye towards it makes education accessible to those that don't normally have access to education. And especially in my context, working at a seminary, the Southern Baptist Convention chartered our seminaries with being able to provide education for any Baptist who wanted education. And in an English curriculum. If you think way far back in seminary education, if you didn't have a degree basically in the classics, if you didn't have Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, then it was really hard to go on and do a Master of Divinity. And so in a context like mine, it's really important to make education accessible to anyone that wants to get education. And so I think that's one of the biggest things that asynchronous online education allows for. It builds a way where someone does not have to pack up and move to a brick and mortar school. Now, there are certainly advantages there. I'm sitting in an office at a brick and mortar school. I moved to this brick and mortar school. I was actually a bivocational associate pastor on the south side of Atlanta, Georgia. I was at First Baptist Sonoy, Georgia. So a lot of you are familiar with an A&E show called The Walking Dead. That's filmed in that town. So my former church is in several scenes and shots, if you've ever seen that show. But I was there, and I was a high school teacher for the state of Georgia. And really wrestling with the fact that I had done a secular degree and wanted theological education. And it was really hard to do because I was really committed to being a high school teacher and to that local church. And I had several great pastors who were friends who encouraged my wife and I, no kids yet, just to pack up and move to seminary. That's what they had done in the 70s and 80s. And ultimately we made that decision, but I had to walk away from a high school job that I loved, and I had to walk away from a church that I loved in order to move here and do that. Now, I know some of you are doing the math and you're thinking, wait a minute, this was the 1990s. We had distance education there. We had extension centers. New Orleans had an extension center in Atlanta at that point in time. I'm in front of a large window for those of you who can see it. And so every time a cloud goes in front of the sun, you're noticing the lights changing in my office. anyway, um, we did have those things. New Orleans Extension was about 45 minutes away, unless, of course, it was 5 p.m. with Atlanta traffic. And then it wasn't 45 minutes away, it was an hour and a half away. And so things like that really made it difficult to be a high school teacher until 4:45 and then still pursue theological education. And even then, New Orleans had online, but they were using compressed interactive video, which is what we all used back then. I actually taught online high school classes with a Crestron system. And so there was a camera on me and a microphone, and I taught at the chalkboard in my classroom, and we sent that to other high schools in Georgia. And we'll come back to that in a few minutes because there's some inherent limitations in that. But even though we had those things, it was still nearly impossible. And at the end of the day, in the 1998-ish, I guess it was, we finally moved in 2000. I tried to make distance learning work and I couldn't. But an asynchronous approach, especially one that removes those time barriers and having to sit in a classroom or at least in front of a computer and be part of a classroom, it makes theological education, or really any education, doesn't have to be theological, but it makes education accessible to those people that can't leave jobs and benefits and sell houses and do all of those things that tie us to community.
Yeah, well, and it sounds like also in your case, in some ways, it would allow people like yourself to stay in places of meaningful church service as well, and so to continue to have kingdom impact in those areas. And I think sometimes people think of the cost benefits, but it sounds like when it's done best for the best reasons, those aren't necessarily the top of it, but it's also all the things that you don't have to give up or miss out on. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's
so what are
some? Go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to ask, what are some of the unique challenges that you've seen to this type of learning? Then we can talk about its accessibility, which is great, but what about the unique challenges, whether on the teaching side or on the student side?
Yeah, so lots of unique challenges on the teacher side. Let's come at it from the student side for a second, and that will lead us back to sort of pedagogy concerns and how can we address those as educators. So even though a student now has greater access, so they can fit education around the normal day in and day out of their life, we have to think about it now. Whereas any of us who packed up and went to an institution, we were there for class. We knew when we signed up for a course that was 12 to 3 in the afternoon, we couldn't do anything from 12 to 3. We had committed to a class and we were going to go to that class and we were going to sit and we were going to learn. And then that would absolutely entail homework. So I knew I was going to have to give up time outside of that class as well. And that's a little more difficult because if you think of a normal person who's working probably an 8 to 5 job, could be shift work, but a third of their day roughly is going to be devoted to work. And then they're going to have a life, whether they're single or married, kids or no kids. We have those things that we have to do. We have social commitments, we have church, we have other things. And so then you take the time that's left over and now you fit class into that. And so when we fit class into that, gone is this idea of from 12 to 3, I have to be in class and then I have to do homework somewhere else. Now there's less time in a person's week and they're trying to fit all of education into it. And so we certainly encourage students to take more than 1 or 2 online classes, because if you think about any degree program, when you only take a couple of classes at a time, you're going to stretch that degree out to eternity. And as we all know, the longer it takes to finish, the more drop off we have. At the same time, we probably can't always encourage a normal 5-class semester like you would do in a brick and mortar institution, because fitting that much workload between time in class and time out of class, even if we think in those 2 categories for online, it's really difficult for someone to squeeze all of that into their life. And sometimes we have to sort of pull students along for a semester or 2 semesters and convince them that education has to be the priority if they're going to continue and graduate, and the other things of life have to fall away a little bit. So maybe there are things in life that you back down on in your commitments so you can really press through another year or two and finish your education. And so those type of time constraints that we think in then have to affect you and I as educators. So all of us, even I, for as long as I've been doing this, we tend to conceptualize out of the classroom because that's how we were educated. And that's sort of the foundational pattern that we have, even when we think about going to an online class. So when I think about teaching Hebrew, of course, the first thing I think about is, okay, what do I need to say about this chapter to help my students get it? And so I sit down and I record my lecture. And I tend to think, well, on campus this week, that would have taken 3 hours. So I record a big, long lecture. And that doesn't work well then when you think about the student who's fitting this extra stuff into their life. And so I have to sort of reconceptualize as the faculty member, and I have to start asking the questions of, okay, if I imagine my normal day, 8 to 5, and I can't do anything school related in that, and then I go home and I'm going to want to eat dinner with my family, and I know I'll have to help my daughter. She's doing some early chemistry stuff. And so I need a good hour to sit with Julia and talk about electron clouds. And then, at some point I want to be done for the night. So let's say around 10 o'clock, I want to be done and I want to wind down. Then I've got a 2-hour window in there. What do I need to get done for Hebrew in that 2-hour window? And so I try to think like one of my students, and then I think that way as a professor. And so I have to start asking questions like, okay, what in here needs a long lecture from me and what doesn't need a long lecture? What might be better served instead of one lecture and trying to get my students to watch it early in the week? What might better be served by a couple of lectures scattered throughout the week? And then I try to tell my students, listen, I want you to watch the first part of this on Monday. I want you to do homework questions 1, 2, and 3. Then on Wednesday, I want you to do this. And so I really have to sort of reconceptualize the way I think about teaching, and I have to figure out how to spread it out and what to do. And sometimes that's trial and error. Sometimes that's the wisdom that you and I get from trying something in a class and it doesn't work well. Sometimes there's no easy answer on that.
Yeah, certainly. Now, how do you assess that then as you're, teaching the class for the first time? Do you build things in to get a sense from students on, oh, was that too much of the lecture at once? And then do you tweak it for the next time? Or how did you, it sounds like you're really good at putting yourself in the mind frame of your students. How did you develop that ability?
That really came from teaching classes and trying to figure out what worked well and what didn't work well. And so at first I would go over all of the homework and I would film it, and I would set up a PDF on a computer that we have here that I could annotate as a PDF file. The new version of Microsoft Edge, normally I'm not a giant Microsoft fan. They're perfectly fine, but I don't always tout Microsoft as the best. But the newest version of Edge will open a PDF and it will let you annotate it natively if you have a touch screen. And again, it's a free piece of software. You don't have to do anything or pay for it. So that's an easy yes in my world. But I would open that up and I would go through all 10 Hebrew program problems at the end of the book. And I would section off any prefixes or suffixes. I would highlight infixes. And the next thing you know, I've shot a 50-minute video where I'm trying to show students how to go over their homework. And then I would ask them, after you do your homework in pencil, correct it in ink when you watch my video and then upload that back to me. And I actually do still think sometimes that's a very helpful step. But I realized my 50-minute video wasn't working. When I could go back and watch analytics, even if I would post it to YouTube, you can see the number of views that you have in YouTube and you can see the number of minutes watched. And so I realized really quickly about week 3, nobody's making it through 50 minutes of video. And so that's when it occurred to me, okay, I need to do maybe problems 1 and 2 and then 7 and 8, because typically in any sort of book, even, if we go back to the math classes we had in college, the professor never gave you 1 and 2 on the test. The professor always gave you number 32 and 33 on the test, right? Because the program's built across the homework and became more and more difficult. So maybe if I cover 1 and 2 and I cover 8 and 10, that's enough to help my students get what I need them to get out of going over the homework. And then when I would shoot maybe 2 videos and shorter videos, and I would go back the next week and check the analytics, sure enough, a lot more of my students have watched it, and they have watched it all the way through. And so it was those types of things that helped me to make mid-course adjustments. And of course, now I don't have to do that as much. When I cover homework, I cover less and I cover shorter videos.
Yeah. So I guess our current crisis, obviously, with a lot of professors having to suddenly go online, have you observed people making that learning curve quicker, or what ways have you tried to help faculty see that, or what advice would you give to maybe some of our listeners who are in that very situation as far as these sorts of challenges are concerned?
Yeah, absolutely. So the first encouragement that I gave to all of our faculty here is we really have to have a paradigm shift when we jump from on campus to online. And so just a quick example of the paradigm shift, and it's different across disciplines. I certainly recognize that. But one of the things that we tend to do, let's say that we teach a block class every Wednesday. Well, at the end of last week, you and I would have assigned homework. So probably what's one of those first things we do this Wednesday when we come in, we go over the homework or we quiz to see if they got last week's material. And we had professors that immediately tried to keep that same pattern in an online class. And we use Moodle. It's a really good learning platform for us. We have a great IT department that supports it well and can customize it for our institution. And so we use a weekly format. So every student sees Monday to Sunday as the date range in Moodle, and the particular week that you are in is highlighted. Well, what that sort of intuitively built into our students was the highlighted week is the material. So they would show up the following week, which for us would have been last week actually. But they would show up in the following week and they would have a quiz. And in their mind, that quiz is over the stuff for that particular week. It wasn't over the previous week's material. And that was just a little paradigm shift that we had to make between on campus and online of, you have to not think of the way you've been teaching in the classroom. You have to reconceptualize according to how your students are interacting with the system. And the system here pointed all of our students towards each week is a self-contained unit. Now that doesn't mean don't work ahead, right? We expect students who have a major paper to know that's coming up in week 10 or week 11 and work on it. We don't want you to start a 15 to 20 page paper on Monday and turn it in on Sunday night. That would not produce what we want to produce. But certain things like, the vocabulary quiz, you don't build that in next week over this past week's material. You just make it where it turns off on Sunday night. And after the students have done all the work this week, they know, okay, I have until Sunday night to submit this quiz. So that was one. Another one is you have to start considering workload challenges. We have faculty that love essay questions. In Old Testament survey, I love essay questions. I think we can really find out what our students know when we ask them essay questions. However, grading each essay question in Moodle, you have to click, you have to wait for a window to open, you have to type in the feedback that you want to give in addition to the grade, you have to hit save, there's a couple of seconds there for it to refresh, then you can move on to the next question. So it adds a time and a workload aspect that I don't have if I just have a stack of paper tests in front of me and I can run through them and mark them up and set them to the side. And so you have to consider those things. So for several of our faculty who had midterms due the week that we came back from break, I encourage them really quickly to rethink their midterm and ask, what are those questions that could be served by one or more objective questions? And so by objective, I mean true or false, multiple choice, maybe short answer. Short answer is always tricky in any learning management system I've ever seen, from Canvas to Blackboard to Moodle to Desire to Learn. They're always tricky. Matching is another great one. And so if you could cut off half of your essay questions. So I have 38 students in an Old Testament class right now. So for 10 essay midterm, that's 380 questions plus that time lag that's built into the system. That's a lot of grading. If I could cut half of those off, and let's say that I turn it into each one into 4 multiple choice questions. So now I've got 20 questions that the learning management system is going to grade for me. I never have to touch them. And then I can just grade the 5 essays or the 4 or the 3. And so again, I know there are pedagogies and practices that we love when we're in the classroom. I love them too. But when we move to an online format, we have to start considering, okay, so what now has the online system added to my world, and how do I counter that?
Yeah.
So another great example from languages, we love for people to write paradigms. Parse this verb for me, or give me the paradigm for, this particular participle, all of those sorts of things. It's really hard to get students to write in language on a computer. So is there a way we can flip that, and we can have them pick something objectively that tells us the correct answer, whether that's multiple choice again? So it's those things that we have to sit down and we just have to sort of rethink, what do I want to do and what do I want it to accomplish in the student? And then how can I reformat that where it works better online?
Yeah, that's helpful. So what types of content, activities do you find most conducive to the online format, especially activities that might be helpful for those, thinking right now, oh, how do I switch to this mode when I already have my syllabus and I have these activities? Are there any kind of go-to activities, content, assessments that you would recommend?
Yeah, absolutely. um, For any writing, writing by parts really seems to work well in an online environment. On campus, we can say you have a biblical exegesis paper. Again, I teach Old Testament, right? So this is where my examples are flowing out of. But you have a biblical exegesis paper at the end of the semester. And that's kind of all I have to say. I give the instructions in the syllabus, but my students can walk into class, and if there's ever a question, or if they ever want to talk about their thesis or their argument, they can throw it out before or after class. And I lose that in an online asynchronous environment. So if I just post a threaded discussion in week 3 that says, by this week, you should at least have your thesis, post your 1 sentence thesis right here. That gives me a chance to interact with them, and it gives me an incremental check to make sure that they're doing something towards their paper. And then maybe by week, let's say 8, I'm assuming a normal 15-week semester here, right? You could adjust depending on your time frame. But maybe by week 8, I say, I want to see the first 4 pages of your rough draft, right? I don't care if it leaves off mid-sentence, that's fine. I just want to see your introduction. Tell me what you're going to argue and how you're going to do it. And then I can provide some feedback on that. So taking a paper that's really easy on campus and slicing that into manageable parts a few weeks apart gives me the chance to interact, and it gives me a check-in with the students to make sure that they're doing something. We all hate threaded discussions. We jokingly call them here the dreaded threaded discussion, but they can actually be useful depending on the ways that you use them. Many of our classes, especially pastoral ministry, leadership, counseling, use them for case studies, and they'll actually put the instructions in there of, you have to respond with your first answer to this case study by Wednesday of this week. So students know I've got 3 days, I have to read this, I have to give some sort of response. And then that gives the faculty member a chance to jump in and interact. And even if you don't interact with every individual post, that would be wonderful. What student wouldn't want a professor to interact with them every single time, right? But also probably not feasible. But even if a professor can jump back in and say, so here are the major ideas that I'm hearing, here are the major difficulties that I'm hearing, have you thought about, and then throw something else out and say, you have Friday night to respond, to my follow-up question. So something like that actually works well to get students in and to get them engaged. And it's a break from the norm of the traditional, here's my question, please post your answer, and please reply to 2 of your friends, which really is that thing that we dislike. I actually offer 5 threaded discussions in my Old Testament class, 1 every 3 weeks. And I tell students they only have to pick 3. So just like in a regular on-campus class, I don't expect every student to talk to me about every topic every week, or to turn to their classmates and reply to their classmates. I don't expect them to do that in an online environment either. So I will throw out some type of question. A lot of times I'll ask a question about the form of a psalm, dissertation topic. I'll throw out a question about the form of a psalm, and then I'll ask a more open-ended follow-up question to it. And I'll tell everybody that they have to reply to my first question, and then to the follow-up. And so if I do that in, say, a class of 40 students, I'll usually only get about 10 replies each time I do one. And that's a lot more manageable for me to jump in and interact with the students as well. And then I just tell Moodle, drop the lowest two, because if students only participate in three, two they're going to get a 0 on, and Moodle knows to go ahead and factor those out. That's just an easy way that I have it set up, so I don't have to worry about at the end of the semester the grading. Things like that work really well. Provided that it doesn't require a lot of feedback from you. Let's say that you're in a particular class that teaches a process and you're doing a worksheet on that. What you've just roped yourself into is then having to grade those worksheets and having to give feedback. Because if it's a process and a student's not doing it correctly, that's not the type of assignment you just want to slap a 78 on the top of it and give it back to the student. You want to correct the process. And so again, that's where you have to think about, okay, what do I want the student to learn out of this particular assignment? And what is it going to take for them to learn that? But those are really easy check-in quizzes, not necessarily for a grade, but just to make sure that they're getting the material out of it. So if you think about it in a class, a lot of times you'll throw out a question for the class to answer about something that they've read or some topic that they've been interacting with. Most of our learning management systems will let you offer a quiz that's for 0 credit. And I know what you're thinking, like we all think it like, well, then what's the point? Like, why is a student going to do this, right? Don't tell them it's for 0 credit. And so you throw it in there and ask 3 questions about the reading, and that'll give you an instant check that week, not on whether they did it or not, but did they understand it? And so it's really easy for me to look down a list of grades and see a lot of 60s and realize that if I've asked 3 questions, there's one of these that somebody is not getting. And so that's another really easy one to throw into however your learning management system is arranged, by topics, by weeks, by sections. It's really easy just to pitch that in there, and then I get feedback. And so that might mean by the end of the week, I shoot one more supplemental video where I say, it looks like a lot of you students really struggled with the difference between a NIFAL imperfect and a CAL imperfect. I just want to show you that paradigm one more time, and I really want to highlight that vowel that you're looking for, the long A vowel. And so don't miss this, because if you miss this, it's going to hurt you all the way to Hebrew 2. So something like that is another really easy check-in to do with students.
Yeah, that's helpful. And it sounds like one thing that's coming out here is that even when we think of the course as asynchronous, we think of it as in some sense undefined as far as time goes. But even though we don't have the kind of crutches of weekly meetings, that means it's all the more important for you to segment out what you're asking students to do in bite-sized chunks, make sure you're ready to provide just-in-time correction and things like that. So that's really helpful. What do you think about live events, either required? We're starting to shift now towards some questions that are coming in via the chat. How valuable are live events, either required or voluntary, for distance courses? And further, can you speak to the value of synchronous online courses?
Yeah, so a lot of people have used live events for a long time in distance learning. We get a lot of requests for this right now because most of the US has just had to move online, and a lot of faculty that have never done that before now are having to. And so they really just want to pull with them the best of the on-campus experience, in their opinion. And that's not a bad thing. And so online check-ins can be great. They can be a huge hindrance. And so, we immediately had some faculty who jumped in. They rescheduled live events to match their on-campus courses. And we immediately started hearing from students in this particular pandemic that said, I work for Kimberly Clark, and we're having to work extra hours to ship toilet paper, tissues, napkins, all of those sorts of things. So I've been assigned a 12-hour shift from 6 p.m. to 6 a.m. for the next 7 days a week indefinitely. And so even though I was in a night class, that now has changed. And so sometimes when we create those things, again, we're right back in that students have a life, students have commitments, and they have a certain window outside of that. And so by forcing online live back into it, we're taking away some of the very opportunities that students have to learn. And so that can be the negative. The positive can be, we all know in the subjects we teach, what are those things that are tremendously difficult in that particular topic, right? What is, sometimes when we talk cognitive load in education, what is germane to the topic at hand? And if you're doing something like differential equations, engineering students, that is inherently more difficult than, say, a history class. No offense to any history people out there. I teach engineering Eastern history, but it takes a different part of the brain and a different level of concentration. And so we all know those things. We know the things that are hard to get. So allowing for an online follow-up on whatever those really difficult topics are, even if it's just to host a question and answer session with the students, that can be tremendously helpful. Because you've taught this long enough, you intuitively know what they struggle with. And so to give them the opportunity to come on live and say, I just don't get it. I don't get it. I need this again. So that can be incredibly valuable. I always recommend to our faculty here, offer multiple chances at those and spread a few out around the calendar and at different times during the day. And so even if some faculty say, okay, in week 3, we're going to do this from 1 to 2 in the afternoon, and week 6, we're going to do this from 7 to 8 p.m., that's great, but it still is going to rob some of your students at week 3 from getting to participate. So it might be better to do shorter format Q&A times, block one from 1:30 to 2 in the afternoon, block another one from 7 to 8 that exact same night, or maybe the next day from 7 to 8 p.m., so that you're giving everybody an opportunity to get in there and participate in the live event, the synchronous, where they can actually have a conversation with you as the faculty member. And so you asked the question of what are advantages to synchronous? So this really gets at the heart of changes in education. All of my college online experience, this would be mid to late 1990s, even my high school experience when I was a teacher, was synchronous. But if you think about it, you went to a college class. Like, I still signed up at the State University of West Georgia for a Tuesday, Wednesday time block. And I went and I sat in a classroom that was painted in neutral colors. All the chairs faced the front where the big screen was at. And I either watched my faculty member, who was broadcast to the Augusta State University, the University of Georgia, or I watched the professor from there. And so there was still very much a mindset of, I've committed to a time, I've committed to a place, I'm going to go there and I'm going to do this one thing. Think about my poor high school students, right? I taught computer programming. So I was writing C++ code on a chalkboard, and some poor kid somewhere in Georgia is watching a TV, like we're all staring at a laptop screen right now, and he's trying to make out my handwriting. Is that CN? C++? What did he just write? Right? So everything was pointed towards that, even though there were some limitations there. The problem that we have with just going live now and saying, all right, my class is going to be from 1 to 4 p.m., y'all show up. A lot of our students' lives aren't going to lend themselves to that. And even if they do, we're going to invade on other things like, do students have enough capability? A lot of our students here in North Carolina are not on a cable internet provider. They're on old-fashioned copper. I'm trying not to name any names or pick on anybody. But the thing that we've noticed is, with our students that are on traditional copper DSL, a lot of times it's not fast enough to support even a Zoom meeting, which has worked the best for us. And so we have to do exactly what we've done in here, where we ask students to come in with mics muted and with video turned off, so that hopefully it reduces their load on the network enough that they can jump in there. So to ask someone to jump in from 1 to 4, that's really difficult. You also have to think about the environment. I went to a classroom and I sat and I said, everything was directed to the front. Everything was painted neutral. There's a million distractions wherever I'm at right now. I'm in front of a window so that hopefully it would be lit well. And I'm noticing students walking around on the campus, and I'm thinking, the campus is closed. Why are you here? right?
Yeah.
As I'm looking around my laptop right now, my phone has gone off no less than 100 times as we've been sitting here. And so there are a lot of distractions around me in this environment
Hmm.
that are not there in a more traditional online, live, compressed, interactive video type environment. And there's nothing I can do to control that. I can tell my students this class is going to be synchronous. I can tell them from the beginning this is when it's going to be and the times that it is going to be. But I can't control the environment like I control a classroom when they come on campus. So there are inherent advantages to live,
Yeah.
and there are inherent disadvantages as well.
Well, this is kind of a follow-up question that someone sent to me, and so those of you who are listening, we are fielding questions now. So feel free to submit those in the chat or send them to Dennis Greason. The question is, how can you move from information through to inspiration in a digital format? Now, this is obviously connected to some of what you were saying with the synchronous events. But how, even in an asynchronous format, do you resist just turning it into mere information transfer, which I think we all acknowledge we want education to be more than just mere information transfer. So what are some tips there?
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great one. So when we think of a normal classroom, let's not start there. Let's start with online. Um, in any online class, you've really got four main types of interaction that are going on. You have the students interacting with you, the professor. You have the students interacting with each other, hopefully. You have the students interacting with the content of the course. And then we've introduced a new one. You have the students interacting with the system. So they have to have some type of device that gets on the internet. They have to have some type of device. They have to interact with the software. That could be multiple sign-ons depending on the software you use. It could be single sign-on, right? But there's this new barrier between the students and each other, the students and you, the students and the content, which is this thing in front of us. And so in a classroom, hopefully the interaction with me, even in the lecture, is inspiring. Hopefully I'm pushing my students to think about things, not just write down every sentence that comes out of my mouth so they can duplicate it on a midterm or a final. And there's a real paradigm shift that takes place. I know I've said that a lot, but there's a real change that takes place when I switch to online, because a pre-recorded lecture really is not interaction with the professor at all. A pre-recorded lecture is me leading the students to interact with the content. So my lectures really become that type of interaction that fits into interaction with the content, not interaction with the professor. And so I say that to say we get an opportunity in there to really try to inspire our students, because at that point we're leading them to interact with the content. So hopefully my lecture is not just here's what you need to know. Hopefully my lecture then is going further than whatever else I've given them in terms of content. So I use two books in OT Intro and then a collection of articles and other supplemental readings. But hopefully in there, my students would never say that I'm lecturing over the books or repeating the books to them. Hopefully what I give them is in addition to that. Your book says this, have you thought about this? And so that's what I use those things for, is to push them farther in the content or to think even beyond the bounds of what they've just read on a particular topic. And then I can follow up with that in those threaded discussions that I mentioned to you. It's the way that I use those particular threaded discussions. But you can do the same thing. One of our theology professors here has a great exercise that he puts students through. After they've gone through doctrine of the church and something else, he puts them in groups and tells them to pretend that they're the committee at their local church that's writing a divorce, marriage, and remarriage policy. And they have to do this, and then they have to post it in a threaded discussion where all the other groups can see each other's. And then on about Friday of the week, he comes back in the threaded discussion and he says, hey, I've seen the ones that you've posted. Thank you so much. I forgot to tell you. So you're at this particular made up church, in a major urban center. And this family comes in that has just immigrated from, he names a made up place. And The husband tells you that he was a former Muslim and has converted to Christianity, and he and his 3 wives want to, come to your church. And you can almost virtually hear the paper crinkling, right? As all the students are like, my policy is now worthless, right? And they all have to go back to the drawing board because he finds a way to put something in there that they didn't think of. And so that's actually Dr. Scott Hildreth, if some of you know Dr. Scott Hildreth. But he finds a way to slip that back in. And are there frustrations in that, right? Because some students look at that and they're like, I have to have everything done by Sunday. Why did you do this on Friday? And so you try to curb those frustrations. Scott will usually say, look, I'm gonna give you an extra week. I'm gonna give you to the next Sunday to think about this piece. But you try to find those creative ways that you can insert something back in like that your students can't just simply throw back 4 answers to you that came out in a lecture. Now they all have to go, okay, well, how do we deal with this in a particular topic? And you just look for those ways that you can slip those in there. Maybe that then becomes one of the live events, right? You talked about a not required, but an extra live event. Maybe the following week you say, look, I read all of your policies. These were great. What do you do in a situation like this? And then you just toss out a handful of those to your students. And so I would say that's one of the things that we all have to work really well at in our online classes is just being creative. We've all practiced it. We do it in a classroom without even thinking about it. Now we just have to give it some thought to get it in online.
Well, what about some tips for teachers who want to make their interactions with students more personal in this environment, but also don't want to be overwhelmed at the same time?
Yeah. So that's a great question. We're currently running into this particular issue because we happen this semester to have a lot of really large language classes. I have 46 in my Hebrew hybrid, which sounds daunting except for the fact that it used to be partially online and partially face-to-face. It's not that daunting when it's face-to-face and I can bring in my TA and we can divide and conquer. Now it has become instantly daunting because it's all online and there's 46. And so what do you do with that? Really the best thing that I have found there, just for me this semester, as I have faced this, is to divide students up into groups. I actually let Moodle do that for me. It just auto-assigned them. And then I have actually scheduled with those groups. So obviously I can't do too many groups. That'll overwhelm my calendar. But I think I did 8 or 9 apiece. So I have like 5 groups. And then I have tried to find a time. I've used a scheduling tool like Doodle. If you've never seen Doodle, essentially it just gives you 5 days out of the week and hour-long segments is the way that I set it up. And students pick every one that they're available for. And then it tells me out of 5 students' responses, here are the windows when everybody is available. Then I can schedule a live follow-up, or Moodle actually has a chat feature. I can put a chat in a particular week in Moodle and I can limit it to a group so that not everybody can see it. And I can say, okay, this is your hour, the 8 of you. Ask me your questions, talk me through this. What are you struggling with? Or I can proactively throw out questions. So what did you do on question 8 of the homework? And so that really became divide and conquer for me. If it's something like writing by parts, it just becomes a little overwhelming, especially if you have 40 students. We cap our English Comp 2 classes a little bit smaller for that very reason. We cap our communications classes smaller for that reason, so that students actually have an opportunity to speak and then to be evaluated by the professor as well as by their peers. Their peers get a very specific form to fill out so that it's not just a free-for-all when they get to evaluate each other. So some of that may be at an administrative level. You just have to say, due to the content, we have to make this smaller. At other times, you may just have to figure out how you can divide and conquer on particular assignments.
Yeah, that's helpful to think about. Now, for those listening that are in this situation where they've been in a face-to-face environment and now suddenly they're needing to do this online, at least for a short term, I mean, what are your tips? I mean, you've mentioned how long lectures aren't necessarily as helpful. I mean, what are your tips there? And also, how do you manage the workload when you go from, everybody's going to turn in their paper on this day to everybody's turning in their paper at different times and they're all emailing you with what are some tips there? Just some real, just
Yeah.
maybe things that you learned as you went over the last 14 years that could be really helpful to our listeners who, are like 2.5 weeks into this.
Yeah, so that's a great question. So let me talk interaction with the system again, right? So when you think about this hurdle that now has been set between us and our students, which is the software, the computer, all of those things. First of all, use that to your advantage. So you know your content. Go ahead and organize your class page, your topic, whatever it is, according to what works best for you. So in my Old Testament class, I simply put in the headings, watch, read, assignments. And so they know that they have all 7 days, and I've just told them, you've got to watch this, you've got to read this, you've got to do this. And I immediately reformatted my Old Testament class that way. So the students just understand, okay, here's my box for this week. Language classes I did differently. Some of our professors actually found a way to do bullet points on the Moodle class page, and they turn their bullet into a box so that it looks like a checkbox, and you start the week at the top and you work your way to the bottom. I had sent an email all the way back in week 1 to my students where I suggested, if you follow this format, you can be done every week by Friday night and you can enjoy your weekend and not have to work on Hebrew. So I immediately went back and found that email that I sent them. I sent it to them again, and then I made sure that my Moodle page headings for my Hebrew were Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. And I put what I wanted them to do under every one of those days. So it matched that email that they had already seen twice. And it, obviously very different format than my Old Testament class, but I did that to help my students. The other thing I did was I built a forum at the top of my Moodle class page called the Questions for Professor. And I set it up in Moodle. It's called a single simple discussion, but basically all it does is you can't create a topic. So I don't have nested topics under the threaded discussion. Everything is straight down the page. And so my instructions were, if you have a question about the course content, post it here. If it's a question of a personal nature or about your grade, then you must email me. And so it's we're in about the 3rd week now after we shifted. And so every time I got an email from a student that was about an assignment in the hybrid class or the on-campus class, anything really, my only response would be, post this in the forum on the class page. That's all they would get. And if it was important enough, they would go over and do that. But what that immediately did was it helped me start managing the communication overload that I was getting in email. The other thing that I did, I've had some assignments throughout the semester that I've allowed to be submitted by email. I started communicating last week that that's now off. I've posted assignments in Moodle, and you have to go in and you have to post the assignment in Moodle. I've been very flexible on the dates and times in there, just because I understand for some of my students that's brand new. And so I've had a few of them tell me they didn't get something posted until Monday. And they were like, Dr. Lassetter, I'm sorry I didn't do it by Sunday night when you asked. Will you still accept it? And I've told them for right now, yes, I'll still accept it. Now, that student may have waited until Monday morning. They may be completely cheating the system, all true things. Or they may really have had a hard time figuring out how to upload a Word document in Moodle. Yeah. And so I just cut them some slack on that. But controlling the information overload, controlling where I get assignments, how I get those assignments, all of that has been critical as even I've dumped my own campus classes into an online format. And then over communicate everything. If I post a Monday morning announcement in every class in our Moodle system, which I do, I make sure by midweek I send an email just to the whole class, reminding them of what needs to be done or reminding them of an upcoming assignment. Hey, don't forget your midterm is next week. You should be studying this week. Don't put that off until next Monday. And that's the first thing that you see in Moodle. Or Moodle will track participation. If I notice 15 of my 20 students are logged in on Sunday, I remind them that looking at this 1 day per week and the last day when everything is due will not be good enough.
Yeah.
So about 3 weeks of hitting them with those things, and they start to adjust to the new norm. And that's really helpful.
Well, let's we've got 5-10 minutes left here, so let's do a lightning round where we'll try to ask shorter questions, and also you're just going to be stuck trying to
Shorter answers.
answer them quicker. But you mentioned just a second ago they might be cheating the system, and that's a word that has come up in the questions. How do you approach online assessments, especially regarding cheating or using external supports during a quiz? Or should we think differently about the nature and purpose of assessments? That's a hard one to do fast, but that's your task.
It is. So some professors make their assessments more difficult and tell students, I don't care what outside resources you use any one you want. Some professors make assessments far more skills-based. And then again, no matter what resources you use, provided that you can demonstrate you can do this particular skill. One thing we do in language classes is we include a word they have not seen yet. And then for the students that get it right, we shoot them an email and say, hey, you don't have this for 3 more chapters. How did you know this one? And then we correct it depending on the student's response.
Very good. How do you handle chat messages when you're doing a live synchronous session? Someone put that as a chat message and I'm trying to deal with it live.
I usually tell my students that chat is for questions, and I will look at those once we're done with our question and answer, or as I have time and we'll come back to it.
All right. What about any recommendations you have? Are there particular books that you would recommend about online teaching or online learning for professors or students?
Yes. The author's last name is Stavridis, Effective Online Teaching and Effective Course Building. And then there is a new book that I'm working through right now called Alt-Ac, or maybe Alt-Ac, for Alternative Academic. It's a great one for people who are thinking about going into higher education, because the idea of getting a PhD and then getting a tenured professorship is pretty much gone the way of the dodo bird.
What about, are there any software programs that you recommend? Some have asked about, Bible study software, things like that, or things that are particularly helpful for Hebrew or just theological education in general, software that you would recommend?
Yeah, for languages, there's so much right now that's online and free. Maybe I could produce a list and give it to Dennis Greason and y'all could email it out to everybody. There's just so many resources that are out there.
Yeah.
For teaching online, Screencast-O-Matic is free and does a great job if you want to capture annotating like a PDF or a Word doc or something. Then you can pay for the cheaper but has more features version of it, which is Snagit. Then you could pay for Camtasia, which is how Khan Academy does everything, and it's gorgeous. It's also $200. An iPad actually works really well if you have that as an iOS device. You can screen record on there, and they actually do a really exceptional job of that. For a learning management system, I actually do love Moodle. It takes a little bit of time to set it up, but it can work really well, and you're not paying $250,000 a year in licensing fees.
Yeah, very good. If you had a month notice that everybody was going to be moved online for instruction mid-March of 2020, what would you have done to prepare your faculty for that?
Great question. Reconceptualizing the differences between teaching in a classroom and teaching online, interaction with the system, how to lower that barrier as much as possible for the students, then how to accomplish what you want to accomplish as a faculty member through quizzes, assignments, testing, all of those things that go into building out your course on a course page. We just tackle them one at a time.
Yeah, very good. Well, what last words of encouragement or advice would you like to offer here?
I would say that we all know and love face-to-face interaction in a classroom. And I even would never make the argument that online is 100% as good as that. I would say it's different. It's perfectly good, but it's different. And so if we can think of it that way, so it's not, I'm taking my own campus, let me go record a 3-hour lecture and I'm putting it online. But if we think of these as two different education models, both are really good and have inherent advantages and disadvantages, that you really can teach well online, and your students can learn well and can apply it well. And they'll have what they need to be effective ministers and working jobs.
Good. Well, thank you again, Dr. Lassetter, for being with us. Thank you for your work at Southeastern and for your work training gospel ministers and missionaries and all that. It's great to be able to learn a little bit from you, as many on this webinar are called to similar things, and I think that what you've shared with us today will help us all do that more faithfully, especially in these weeks.
Absolutely. Thank you for having me.
All right. Have a good afternoon.
You too.
All right. Thanks, everybody. That's the end of our conversation. Thank you for being with us and listening to this BibleMesh Institute conversation. And I hope that you found some helpful things out of it, and that the Lord will bless you in your both teaching and learning going forward in the current situation.